So, our guests are Larisa MINASYAN from the Open Society Institute, Armenia. Okay, Larisa, please.
Thank you, and first of all, thank you for enabling me this opportunity. Before starting, I want to take a moment and congratulate Dmitry and Belarusian people with the Nobel Prize winner Svetlana Alexievich. I think this is a great, great victory of not only her, but people and all those who really care for the issues she writes about. So, congratulations to all. My name is Larisa MINASYAN. I represent Open Society Foundations in Armenia. It's, as I said, it's a privilege to speak here, and it's despite knowing that you're all very tired and probably already checking in mentally, checking out and checking into the planes. The good thing about speaking last is that I got so much more confidence than I was yesterday in the morning, because I know that the issues that I was dwelling and we were dwelling in our work are very, very relevant and shared. It's about the place of the legislation, its enormous limitations and huge challenges apart from the legislation that we all face. First of all, a few words about, I know that many of you have been very closely cooperating with Open Society foundations in your countries and do know about the organization. I won't vex about the general features of the organization, but in Armenia, our work in anti-discrimination has started very early on when we started, and has been a very profound feature of our work as part of human rights and part of rights of vulnerable and marginalized people. The work is as diverse as publishing the first Assyrian language textbook, going into strategic litigation for hate speech and hate crimes, building capacity of minorities, working on legislation, supporting policy, research and policy changes, and doing a tremendous amount of monitoring of violations of marginalized and vulnerable groups' rights. So with that capacity, and only with that capacity, I am confident speaking to you, not being a lawyer and not being an activist myself. So first of all, some statistics. I'll focus on only two groups, religious and ethnic, as this is the topic of the conference, or the focus of the conference. Armenia is extremely homogeneous in its confessional picture and in its ethnic picture. It's 98.1 Armenian Armenian population. 92% of population, as per last census, identify themselves with Armenian Apostolic Church. This last figure is very, very questionable because the question was not often asked. It's just ethnicity Armenian Apostolic Church goes as a tick from the people who were doing census, and that's very remarkable because this attempt to equate ethnicity and being an Armenian Apostolic Church follower is very prevalent and damaging in Armenian legal policy, in Armenian public narrative, public discourse. So this is something that I would advise you to take with caution when it comes to statistics. As national minorities, the largest minorities we have are Yazidis, Assyrians, Russians, but again, this is within less than 3%. As non-Armenian Apostolic Church and atheists, we have, of course, Armenian Catholics, evangelical followers, Jehovah Witnesses, many others. In terms of legislation, Arnold was very right to say that the draft law was submitted to the Parliament. One tiny correction: debates started, but I'll come to that later. And to anti-discrimination legislation later, because that's kind of one piece in such a complex picture. One very important piece, but the mountain itself is very controversial and important itself. Armenian Constitution, which will be amended on December 6th, now we know the date. Armenian current constitution, acting constitution, has such a line in its preamble. Armenian people, not as citizens, but ethnically Armenian. In Armenian language, it's different. So Armenians, recognizing the public vote referendum, it comes from 91, and public will declare this country as independent, sovereign, democratic country. So already in the preamble, it's inaccurate, because Armenian, sitting next to me, does not accept that, does not vote on that constitution. And so are the majority of Armenian people, 8 million outside Armenian borders. And it's obviously discriminatory, because Armenians have ethnic minorities, and we're not accepting it as Armenians, but we're accepting it as Armenian citizens. It also has in its preamble, or in one of the articles, the line stating that Armenian Apostolic Church, the state recognizes exceptional role of Armenian Apostolic Church in Armenian history and Armenian culture. The amendments that we will be voting on December 6th, at least the last version I saw, because the draft has been still in working, says drops that historic important role and is a role in Armenian society. So it's getting worse as we go. So exceptional role of one of the churches, Armenian Apostolic Church, is basically will be enshrined in Armenian Constitution. Venice Commission advises us to read that not as an exceptional, somehow they're masters in Armenian language too, not as an exceptional, but as a unique role. So every Armenian reading that line will read it as exceptional. So let's leave it as that. Of course, Armenian Constitution does enshrine inacceptability or bans discrimination on all grounds. However, as Arnold said, we don't have a standalone and comprehensive legislation for anti-discrimination, but the situation is basically worse. There is no, as in Belarus, there is no definition of discrimination in Armenian legislation apart from only one issue, and it's different from Belarus. It's based on gender, because we do have a law on equal rights of men and women, not gender equality law. So in that law, there is a definition of discrimination. However, nowhere else there is a comprehensive definition of discrimination, neither there is a definition of different types of discrimination. There is no working existing mechanism or a body where you can fight or you can file discriminatory accusation, claim on discrimination. Sundry measures are throughout Armenian legislation: labor code, education law, criminal code, code on administrative violations, but is missing in very many important codes, such as civil code, laws on fundamental of administrative action and admin proceedings. So these are important pieces where discrimination is not even mentioned. So this very declarative approach to legislate on discrimination brings to inability and very much difficulty of fighting different acts of discrimination, and unfortunately, since what happened are not mentioned with the legislation, things are getting murkier by the day. So you wouldn't know or wouldn't remember the specifics of why there was a draft but there is no legislation, and I'll remind you of that. Armenia is a member of Eastern Partnership, and Armenia was a country on a road map, on a track to sign association agreement. And Armenia negotiated association agreement to the very full stop of every clause. It closed all clauses of negotiation, and the work was tedious, lasted 3+ years. The work was largely manipulative. Now and then we have been saying that, because legislative changes were made so that they were honoring the letter of the law but not the spirit of the law. But however, the clauses were closed. And yet on September 3, 2013, less than 2 months, or somewhat 2 months before the official signing, 3 months of the association agreement, Armenian president announced that we're not signing the agreement, we're going to Russia-led customs union, which later became a Eurasian economic union. So that was actually not the beginning. The beginning, now in hindsight, I can tell you that the beginning of changing the narrative happened earlier. Probably the decision was made, and 6-7 months prior to that, a very rampant and clearly Russia-provoked and Russia-led campaign against gender equality, against LGBT, has started in Armenia. Particularly focusing on the newly passed gender equality law. And why it is so clear that it was Russia-led, because the materials were all in Russian and from Russian websites and from Russian organization Parents Union. It's only much later when it was so pointed out that people, this is all Russia doing, they started translating materials into Armenian. So, that said, I want to make a point that this is the issue. The tolerance is the issue. The discrimination is the issue that the authorities want to rally on anti-democratic, pro-Russian sentiments, and they want to and they largely use the issue for their manipulative reasons, which is only too damaging for a great cause of equality and anti-discrimination. So on one hand, we see throughout the history that in 2001, when Armenia membered the Council of Europe, we started using this as a leverage to greatly improve our legislation and basically make changes in alternative civil service, in enabling ombudsman office, in having ECHR access. Approximation with the EU association agreement was yet another leverage that we were using to promote a comprehensive anti-discrimination legislation, and yet the same EU approximation is used very much manipulatively against anti-discrimination, to rally the sentiment as clashing the Armenian national values with European imported values. So, so there is that. I have to really mention this, and I know that it's not unique. We hear that throughout the region. So now what? Specifically, I'll say a few words about specific legislations too, and then go on, because what matters is what the legislative situation we have. In terms of national minorities, neither the situation nor the legislation is too bad. No report states overt hostility against minorities living in Armenia. There is no pronounced anti-Muslim sentiment. However, promoting racism is not criminalized. Organizations promoting racism are not dealt properly. There is no comprehensive law on that too. Education in mother tongue is not accessible. It's not denied, it's there, but government authorities don't do anything proactive to secure that. There is request, we will train teachers. There is request, we will publish textbooks. So far, it's not happening beyond education of the language only. That's an issue. The parents are not properly informed of the laws stating that they can request that type of education. When it comes to religious minorities, the situation and the laws are much worse. The invasion of Armenian Apostolic Church into secular sphere, as I mentioned, is rampant. Education sphere is particularly important because by all reports it's there where a very intolerant outlook into the world, particularly for people living in 92% homogeneous, in 98% homogeneous society, is formed and is forced and reinforced. Children of parents of different denominations are singled out. They're educated. They're basically educative talks are carried out with them of the teacher and the priests by the admission of the Ministry of Education persons. So this is the situation. In 60 schools as a pilot program, a 2 to 4 grades course on Christian teaching is taught as an elective, but as a pilot, but is going to be as mandatory as per our Minister of Education. As I said, the narrative is quite alarming. Only yesterday, when during the hearings in the Parliament of the report of public television, our Deputy Speaker of the Parliament reprimanded public television for not having sufficient educative programming on Armenian Apostolic Church and the 70 years of darkness where that was not accessible. And the public TV promised to oblige. So this is kind of the narrative coming from a very top. When it comes to other groups, LGBT, you can imagine it's far worse. So legislatively, the law on religious minorities, on religious organizations is not good. The government promised to improve that, and the draft law they developed is horrible. It literally speaks of soul hunting, and it regulates the sphere much to detriment of diversity and freedom of conscience. So this is kind of the legal background that we have at the moment. When it comes to anti-discrimination draft, it was debated in the parliament, and debate was notoriously alarming. It was as if unleashing all the worst nightmares, because people were competing in speaking against that very not Armenian, not national value, not disgusting law that is brought, because it is identified in and is promoted to be identified as the law for LGBTI rights only. So that makes it much more difficult to champion that law for groups such as religious minorities, such as disabled people, such as national minorities. They don't see the law, even if they see the law as their own, they don't want to speak up and identify with the law. The Ombudsman himself, the moment September 3 happened and the U-turn happened, the Ombudsman himself revoked the draft law from the parliament. So it's now not even in circulation. Just to mention that when it was in circulation, it did have a lot of problematic issues. It didn't specify grounds of discrimination. It didn't include LGBT. It was very vague in many parts, but since it's not in circulation, I won't stop on that. However, after almost a year of limbo, of us not knowing how we are, what our leverage is going to be to promote the legislation and basically to work for anti-discrimination. And in that year, we basically shifted more to UN and UPR, and luckily we had UPR for Armenia last year, so we submitted reports from civil society on human rights, but including anti-discrimination, hate crime, and hate speech. I brought some copies if you're interested. However, after a year of not saying no to Europe, although not signing the association agreement, and really trying to play on both fields, the Armenian government conceded to some conditionality from European Union, which we lobbied and which is luckily very important human rights conditionality, which also includes, among other very important points, anti-discrimination comprehensive legislation as part of possible visa liberalization offer. So, but even without visa liberalization, it's a conditionality put on table by the European Union for assistance. And for that matter, such pieces of legislation as domestic violence legislation, which was also dropped after September 3, the anti-discrimination legislation is part of, is back on the agenda. So basically, unlike Belarus, we now have a track to follow. There is even a working group formed by the previous justice minister to work on that legislation. The new justice minister has not committed herself yet to the cause, but basically the government itself committed it to adopting anti-discrimination legislation. So this is a very important track we will be following and working, both in terms of monitoring the pieces, how they're coming along, and if they contain sufficient teeth to them, whether that's the anti-discrimination body or the clauses, but also not stopping working very important other work in the areas such as education, and I don't mean only education of public on anti-discrimination, but education system, and public debate and discourse on the issues to bring some more tolerance, without which the legislation will be yet another burden on the legal books, and rather than an instrument to use. I'm happy to answer questions if there are. Thank you.
In the absence of anti-discrimination law, is there any room left for litigation on equality issues, and do you have any experience in this regard, or any successful cases maybe?
Yeah, it's close but different. We still have ECHR case law, of course. We have the gender equality law, where discrimination is defined and is properly defined, so burden of proof is not on the victim. However, indeed, without the legislation, other grounds need to be found to...
Even based on Constitution?
Even based on Constitution, because so far Constitution is direct act, but the burden of proof is still on the plaintiff. So we have cases, and even successful cases. We have one case now in ECHR on hate crime, inciting crime, when LGBT friendly bar was arsoned, so it's the foundation supports that case in ECHR, but we also have 3 other cases in local courts. One we won, and this is on hate speech by an MP. So of course they filed an appeal, but still there is our one there. So there are 4 cases that I know, but there might be more. But they're on different grounds. It's label and defamation, it's hate speech, it's others.
Well, thanks for the presentation. First of all, a comment. I would not rely on the burden of proof, because as our experience shows, and we have more or less the same court system and court misunderstanding in our countries, even having the burden of proof, the mechanism to achieve the burden of proof doesn't provide for courts using it. So we have it in the legislation at the moment, but it doesn't work, because judges do not understand how to use it, and besides, in a criminal and administrative process, we do not need this. This is only for civil process. But the question is, at the situation when you do not have an Equal Rights Act or Anti-discrimination law, whatever you call it, what other things can be done by civil societies to basically to fight discrimination, not at legal level, but at other levels, to both speakers?
The thing is that the answer is a lot, because even with legal means, not only other, Armenia ratified every other protocol you can imagine, even Protocol 12 to European Convention on Human Rights. So legally, we're very well off. It's all the other things that are much worse than one would want to have for exercise of the right. So as I said, even litigation is quite possible. However, a lot in all other senses, because monitoring and filing violations and filing reports to national and international bodies do have some reaction. It's based on civil society reports and facts that systematically, say, State Department's Human Rights Report on Armenia comes with religious rights violations and LGBT rights violations. The EU monitoring body, the Council of Europe monitoring body reports have the same violations put there, and it makes the government to concede. At the UPR session, a standalone legislation was accepted as a recommendation to be implemented. Domestic violence legislation was adopted as a recommendation to be adopted. And of course, I have to say it's to no small degree of civil society fact-based advocacy that the EU had this conditionality for engagement. Because the limbo that we entered wouldn't promote any conditionality or any. So civil society here, unfortunately, and I say unfortunately because as an institute alone is very it's very difficult, is in driving seat for the cause. And that includes educating public through whatever media is available, but trying to safeguard the spaces that are still there. Education space should be free of preaching anti-discrimination or intolerance. And civil society filed a complaint to the World Bank on on discriminatory narrative against women in the textbooks. And they have to take measures. So that's civil society doing, no government doing. So these are having strong, professionally strong, legally strong civil society organizations in freedom of conscience, freedom of expression, and discrimination is very important. Because it's not only general public, but when it comes to civil society, even professional civil society, the awareness on discrimination is not high. Awareness or understanding, not awareness, but understanding of discrimination and the subtleties is not high. So that is a big issue. But in terms of legal and policy, there is a lot to be done. Policy research, surveys. It's the civil society data, such as, say, 85% of Armenian teachers promote leadership and courage in boys and modesty and humility in girls. So those are things that are telling, and society wakes up to the numbers. So there's a lot.
The question was that how the ethnic and religious minority organizations and civil society organizations are reacting or looking at anti-discrimination law as an option.
Differently. The two groups react differently. Religious minorities do own the legislation. They really fight for it. I mean, they're on board with that legislation, promoting that legislation simply because they see very direct advantages that it can give them in litigation and in protection. Ethnic minorities are less so, simply because the policy legislative capacity of the groups, and I don't mean the ethnic minority groups, but of the organizations representing ethnic minority groups, is much lower than not most of the NGOs, but NGOs which are working in advocacy and policy work. So they don't have that intrinsic capacity to analyze and see, but also, as I said, the issue is so manipulated politically, so they don't want to. It's presented as a openly anti-Armenian legislation, anti-national legislation, so they don't want to identify themselves with something which is not intrinsic to the country. It's promoted as European values which are not much shared within those communities too, not the European values, but openness to LGBT groups as well. So they refrain to identify themselves with that. But also, unfortunately, in any non-formal coalition work, these organizations view themselves simply as advocates for rights of that one group without setting the group into a bigger picture of discrimination. And they're encouraged to do so by the government. They're manipulated in that trap. So that's the thing. However, I personally think that we as a donor maybe, and we as a convener of, oftentimes we didn't do our work in reaching out and bringing them on board with this. So that's a fair kind of point to make.